If I have ever wanted to see a group of people tortured, it would be these two. I mean, a tortured, slow, painful passing would just be the icing on the cake. Because these disgusting people use corrosive chemicals to disintegrate her poor little body, tools to chop it up, and then poured, and I want that to sink in, poured the rest of her remains into Cedar Creek Reservoir.
He also revealed that investigators believe corrosive chemicals were used to speed up the destruction of her body before her remains were dumped into the Cedar Creek Reservoir.
That a few human remains were recovered in an area known as Cedar Creek Reservoir, also known as Stumpy Pond in Fairfield County. These remains were immediately sent to the State Law Enforcement Division, and through analysis, the DNA of the remains are consistent with being the biological offspring of Javeayah and Michela. I want to also share with you that through forensic evidence, statements, and analysis, extensive and deliberate efforts were made to destroy and conceal evidence following Javeayah's death. Our information reveals the use of corrosive chemicals and other tools that were used to accelerate the destruction of her little body. After this was completed, these two individuals poured what remains were left of Javeayah into the Cedar Creek Reservoir. These subjects went through great lengths to cover their repulsive and revolting actions. In my 37-year career in law enforcement, I have never, ever heard of anything so horrific. As a result of this information, it's unlikely that the entirety of Javeayah's body or any other remains from this point forward will be recovered. And I'll say this again, we had all hoped and prayed to find her body, but with the information we've uncovered, that's simply not possible. I want to also announce additional charges for destruction and desecration of human remains have been filed against these two individuals. I will not refer to them as mom and dad or mother or father. They don't deserve that title.
For 4 days, an entire state searched for a 4-year-old girl. Then, for another week after that, they searched for something else entirely, evidence of what had truly happened to her. A sheriff with 37 years in law enforcement stood in front of cameras this week and said he had never in his entire career encountered anything as horrific as what his investigators uncovered. He refused to call her parents mother and father. He said they didn't deserve those titles anymore.
I will not refer to them as mom and dad or mother or father. They don't deserve that title.
Behind him stood dozens of his own staff, many wearing pink ties and ribbons, Javeayah's favorite color. Because after everything this investigation had shown them, that was the smallest way they had left to honor her. This is the full story of Javeayah Harris. If you're new here, welcome to MotiveX. We cover cases involving family tragedy and child welfare carefully, factually, and always centering the child at the heart of it. Subscribe before you go, because this case has just taken its most painful turn yet. Let's get into it. Javeayah Harris was 4 years old, 3.5 feet tall, 42 pounds. Small enough that everything that follows should feel heavier because of it. People who knew her describe a bright, chatty little personality, a child who talked more and more clearly than most kids her age. She loved Minnie Mouse. She loved chasing the family's chickens around the yard in the South Carolina heat. Pink was her favorite color, and it shows up in nearly every memory people share of her. Pink beads braided in her hair, pink outfits, a little girl who lit up around the color the way only a 4-year-old can. She lived with her parents in a quiet stretch of Aiken County near Hillsborough Street and Ridgecrest Road. Her parents were young. Her father, Javeayah Harris, was 23. Her mother, Javeayah Harris, was 22. On the surface, an ordinary young couple raising their daughter in an ordinary town. The kind of household a neighbor waves to without a second thought. Notice this, nearly every description of Javeayah from people who knew her mentions the same thing, how trusting she was, how easily she engaged with people. At the time, that was simply how people described the sweet child. Knowing what we know now, it reads differently because the people she trusted most completely were the ones who ultimately failed her. If a child in your life seemed to disappear from public view for weeks and no one outside the household said anything, what would it take for someone to notice? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'll come back to this. It's worth sitting with something child welfare advocates have said for years, something that applies far beyond this single case. Children this young don't have the words or the safety to describe what's happening to them. They depend entirely on the adults around them, parents first, but also neighbors, relatives, anyone paying attention to notice when something isn't right. A 4-year-old can't call for help the way an adult can. She can't reach out to a friend, post a warning online, or drive herself somewhere safe. Her entire world is defined by the adults who are supposed to be watching over her, and when those adults fail her, there's often no one else close enough to see it happening in time. That's what makes the quiet stretch of this story, the weeks before any 911 call was ever made, so important to hold on to as this story unfolds. Somewhere in that quiet stretch, something had already gone terribly wrong inside that home. And for reasons this case is only now forcing into the open, no one outside those 4 walls stepped in soon enough. On a Tuesday evening, sometime around 8:15 p.m., Javeayah's parents told deputies their daughter was gone, not lost far from home, but gone from her own yard, the place a family is supposed to be safest. According to the initial incident report, her mother said she'd last seen Javeayah around 8 p.m., playing with the family's chickens, wearing a pink Disney shirt, shorts, her signature pink hair beads, and her Crocs. Her father told investigators a different piece of the timeline, that he had been running errands that evening, stopping at a laundromat for close to an hour and a half before returning home around 9 p.m., right as the search for his daughter was beginning. Within hours, this stopped being a quiet local matter. The Aiken County Sheriff's Office brought in the FBI. The South Carolina Law Enforcement Division joined next. Search and rescue teams fanned out with K-9 units, drones, and helicopters, eventually covering more than 3,000 acres of land in punishing South Carolina heat. Bethel Baptist Church, just around the corner, opened its doors as a command post. Investigators gathered there before dawn each morning. Digital billboards along the highway carried Javeayah's photo. Roadblocks went up near the search zone. Deputies stopped cars, asked questions, chased down every tip, some nights not finishing until well after dark. To anyone watching, this looked like exactly what it appeared to be. An entire community and state throwing every resource behind bringing a missing child home alive. That is the story everyone believed for 4 days. Local news crews camped near the search perimeter, giving hourly updates. Drone footage aired on local broadcasts, showing search teams moving in long lines through dense brush. Community members who had never met the Harris family before that week showed up anyway, bringing water, offering their own trucks and ATVs to help cover ground faster, walking sections of woods themselves alongside deputies late into the evening. Social media accounts across the region shared Javeayah's photo thousands of times, asking anyone traveling through Aiken County to keep an eye out for a little girl in a pink shirt and pink beads. For 4 days, this was, by every visible measure, a textbook example of a community rallying completely around a family in crisis. If you're the kind of viewer who needs to know how a story ends before you can look away, that's exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe now, because what comes next reframes everything you just heard. As the search stretched into its 2nd and 3rd day, investigators were quietly listening to something just as important as any physical search. The people who knew this family and this street best. Multiple neighbors near the search area told reporters they hadn't actually seen Javeayah in months, not weeks, months. One neighbor, who said she'd lived in the area for years and knew most of the children on the block, put it plainly, she couldn't understand how a little girl could go missing from a yard she passed by constantly, which she couldn't remember the last time she'd actually seen that child outside. A private investigator watching the case from the outside made an observation that mattered more than it seemed at the time. Even as the visible ground search appeared to slow, the real work of the investigation was quietly moving elsewhere, into interview rooms, into records, into digital footprint every family leaves behind. Notice this. The sheriff would later reveal that investigators had run two separate operations from nearly the beginning. One team searched the visible search zone the public could see. A second team worked an entirely separate line of investigation, off camera. The public only ever saw half of what was actually happening. If you were investigating this case in real time, which thread would you have pulled first? The parents' timeline or the neighbor's silence? Tell us in the comments. There was another detail that at the time seemed like ordinary due diligence but reads very differently now. For a stretch of days during the search, deputies stopped and checked every vehicle leaving certain roads near the original search zone, a level of scrutiny usually reserved for the earliest, most urgent hours of a missing child case, not days into an already sprawling investigation. Looking back, it appears investigators were quietly closing every possible gap before making an announcement they clearly wanted to be completely certain of before ever saying it out loud to the public. On the fourth day, Sheriff Marty Sawyer walked to a podium to deliver what he called the hardest announcement of his career to that point. The evidence, he said, now led investigators to believe Javeayah had already been gone for roughly a month, meaning that by the time the 911 call came in on June 30th, it was already far too late to save her. Then came the detail that removed any remaining ambiguity. Both parents were arrested. Javeayah Harris was charged with homicide by child abuse. Michelle Herring was charged with homicide by child abuse and with filing a false police report. That false report charge changes how the entire case has to be understood. It means investigators do not believe Javeayah simply vanished on June 30th. It means the 911 call reporting her missing was never really the beginning of this story. It was, according to the case being built, an attempt to control it. Federal investigators shifted their language completely at that same podium. This was no longer search and rescue. It was now, in their words, a pursuit of justice for a 4-year-old girl who deserved far more than what she was given by the two people meant to protect her most. This is usually the point where our audience says they had to pause the video, because what the sheriff revealed just this week is even harder to hear. That fourth-day press conference stretched on for several more minutes, and it's worth understanding just how many agencies had converged on this one case by that point. The sheriff thanked the FBI's Columbia Field Office by name. He thanked the South Carolina Highway Patrol, the State Law Enforcement Division, sheriffs from neighboring counties who had no obligation to help but showed up anyway, volunteer fire departments who kept crews fed and hydrated through days of South Carolina heat, and the emergency management staff who'd opened a command center before dawn on the very first morning of the search. Reporters in the room described a visible shift in his tone as he spoke, a man who had clearly hoped this press conference would end with different news than the one he was now delivering. Even after both parents were arrested and charged, Javeayah still had not been found. Investigators shifted the search away from Aiken County entirely, focusing on an area near Debutery Creek, close to the Chester and Fairfield County line, a location also known locally as Stumpy Pond, part of the Cedar Creek Reservoir system. Search boats were brought in. The South Carolina Department of Natural Resources joined the effort on the water, working section by section alongside state investigators. A helicopter made repeated loops over the region for hours at a time. For days, roadblocks stayed up around the access point while crews worked. According to newly released arrest warrants, both parents confessed. And this week, Sheriff Sawyer confirmed what the entire community had been dreading and hoping to avoid in equal measure. Investigators had recovered some of Javeayah's remains from the reservoir. DNA testing confirmed they belonged to the biological daughter of Michelle Herring and Javeayah Harris. What the sheriff described next is, in his own words, the most difficult part of this entire case to speak about publicly.
That a few human remains were recovered in an area known as Cedar Creek Reservoir, also known as Stumpy Pond in Fairfield County. These remains were immediately sent to the State Law Enforcement Division, and through analysis, the DNA of the remains are consistent with being the biological offspring of Javeayah and Michela. I want to also share with you that through forensic evidence, statements, and analysis, extensive and deliberate efforts were made to destroy and conceal evidence following Javeayah's death. Our information reveals the use of corrosive chemicals and other tools that were used to accelerate the destruction of her little body. After this was completed, these two individuals poured what remains were left of Javeayah into the Cedar Creek Reservoir. These subjects went through great lengths to cover their repulsive and revolting actions. In my 37-year career in law enforcement, I have never, ever heard of anything so horrific. As a result of this information, it's unlikely that the entirety of Javeayah's body or any other remains from this point forward will be recovered. And I'll say this again, we had all hoped and prayed to find her body, but with the information we've uncovered, that's simply not possible. I want to also announce additional charges for destruction and desecration of human remains have been filed against these two individuals.
Investigators allege that after Javeayah's death, extensive and deliberate steps were taken to destroy evidence and conceal what had happened to her. Efforts serious enough that additional charges of destruction and desecration of human remains have now been filed against both parents. Sawyer told reporters that nearly 4 decades of law enforcement, he had never encountered a case this difficult to process, and that the scale of what investigators found meant it's unlikely all of Javeayah's remains will ever be recovered. Keith chose not to elaborate further on the method, saying only that the actions were repulsive and revolting, and that his office's focus now is entirely on the legal case ahead, not on describing in public exactly what was done. This channel is making the same choice. Some details serve the pursuit of justice. Others only serve to cause further pain, and we won't repeat them here. What we can tell you is what the sheriff was willing to confirm, that the evidence points to a severe injury Javeayah suffered, one that she was never taken to receive medical treatment for, and that in the time between her death and the eventual 911 call reporting her missing, deliberate steps were taken to prevent investigators from ever fully understanding what had happened to her. The gap between those two dates, the actual date of her death and the date her parents finally called police, is, according to the sheriff, one of the most disturbing elements of this entire case, because it means every day of that gap was a choice, not an accident. Notice this. Arrest warrants indicate the destruction of evidence is believed to have taken place on June 8th, weeks before the 911 call that started the public search. That timeline alone tells you how long this family carried a truth the rest of the world wouldn't learn until much later. Both parents were denied bond a second time this week. This time specifically because prosecutors argue they now pose a flight risk given the severity of the new charges. For nearly a week, the search at Desecration Creek continued nearly around the clock. Roadblocks stayed in place at the access point for days, restricting anyone from entering the area while dive teams and search boats worked the water in careful, methodical passes. Then, on a Wednesday, those roadblocks quietly came down. No announcement was made that day. To anyone watching closely, the sudden absence of the barricades that had defined a site for the better part of a week felt like its own kind of confirmation, a sign that whatever investigators had been searching for in some form had finally been found. Investigators also returned to the family home on Hillsborough Street that same week, this time posting crime scene tape and searching both the house and the wooded area just beside it. Staff from the Aiken County Coroner's Office were present as well. A law enforcement source close to the investigation clarified that this particular search wasn't focused on recovering remains. That work was happening at the reservoir, but on gathering additional physical evidence connected to the case. If you were sitting in that courtroom hearing these new charges read aloud, what do you think would be running through your mind? Let us know in the comments. Sheriff Sawyer's press conference this week was unlike almost anything this channel has covered before. He didn't hide his own emotional exhaustion. He told reporters plainly that this had been one of the most difficult and deeply taxing investigations his office had ever handled, and that it had weighed heavily on the entire community around him. He said there were very harsh words he could use to describe Javeayah's parents, but chose restraint instead. What he did say was direct. He would not refer to them as mother and father, because in his words, they no longer deserved those titles. He also made a point of separating this dark chapter from the response it produced. Even in the face of this tragedy, he said, compassion, unity, and service had remained stronger than the darkness his office had encountered. He thanked his own staff, many of whom stood behind him that day wearing pink in Javeayah's memory, for their commitment to finding the truth regardless of how difficult that truth turned out to be. He was careful to note that while this update marked an especially painful chapter, it did not mark the end of the case. His office, he said, would continue working to see that justice is ultimately pursued all the way through the courts. If you believe cases like this one deserve to be followed all the way to a verdict, not just the first headline, subscribe to MotiveX. We'll keep tracking this case as it moves toward trial. What stood out most to reporters in the room wasn't just what the sheriff said, but how carefully he said it. This is a man with nearly 4 decades in law enforcement, someone who has almost certainly stood at that same podium delivering difficult news more times than he could count. And yet, by his own account, nothing in those 37 years had prepared him for this particular case. That admission, coming from someone with that level of experience, tells you something about the weight this investigation has placed, not just on Javeayah's family, but on the investigators, deputies, and staff who have spent weeks living inside the details of what happened to her. Reporters who've covered Sawyer's office for years describe this press conference as noticeably different in tone from anything they'd seen from him before. There was no procedural detachment, no reading flatly from prepared notes. He spoke slowly, at times pausing before continuing, choosing his words with visible care in a way that suggested he understood exactly how many people, not just in that room, but watching from home, were about to have their worst fears confirmed. Several staff members standing behind him were seen wiping their eyes during parts of the announcement, a detail multiple outlets chose to include specifically because it underscored just how far this case had reached beyond the walls of any one office. While investigators worked, something else was happening back on Hillsborough Street. A makeshift memorial began forming around the mailbox outside the family home. Stuffed animals, candles, handwritten notes, pink ribbons tied to the fence. One woman, Donna Chavis, visited the memorial and spoke about what had pulled her there despite never having met Javeayah. She described wanting simply to hold her, to comfort her the way any mother would want to comfort a child in pain. She said she had cried more in the last week than she could remember crying in a long time, over a child she had never known personally, because what happened to her felt impossible to fully absorb any other way. Around 100 people gathered one evening for a more organized vigil. Neighbors, strangers, people who had followed the case online and felt compelled to show up in person. Pink ribbons appeared throughout the neighborhood. Candles were lit along the fence line night after night, even as investigators continued their work 2 hours away at the reservoir. That contrast says something important about this case. In the same week that a sheriff stood at a podium describing the most horrific investigation of his career, a community was simultaneously showing up again and again, refusing to let a 4-year-old girl's memory be reduced only to the details of how she was failed. Notice this, even before any trial date has been set. Even before the legal case has truly begun, this community had already decided how Javeayah would be remembered, not as a case number, but as a little girl who deserved so much better, and who is still, in every real sense, being held by the people around her now. What do you think this community will look like a year from now once this case finally reaches trial? Share your thoughts in the comments. The memorial outside the family home has continued to grow with each passing day. What began as a handful of stuffed animals and candles left quietly by a few early visitors has become something much larger. Handwritten letters addressed directly to Javeayah, pink balloons tied along the fence line, small toy chickens left by people who'd read about how much she loved chasing the family's real ones around the yard. Local florists reportedly donated flowers to the site without being asked. Children from nearby streets, accompanied by their parents, have left drawings, crayon renderings of Minnie Mouse, of little girls with pink beads in their hair, small gestures from kids who understood, in their own way, that this was a story about someone their own age. That kind of grassroots, spontaneous mourning, for a child most of these mourners never personally met, says something about how deeply this case has cut into this community's sense of safety. It's the kind of grief people usually reserve for someone close to them, extended instead toward a stranger, simply because she was 4 years old and she deserved better than what she got. One woman, describing why she felt compelled to visit the memorial despite never meeting Javeayah, said it wasn't really about the specific details of the case at all. It was about recognizing something universal in a small child who trusted the people around her completely, the way every 4-year-old does, and having that trust met with the worst possible outcome imaginable. Mothers who visited the site described holding their own children a little tighter that week. Fathers described checking in on their kids' bedrooms at night in a way they hadn't in years. Grief, in this case, didn't stay contained to one family. It moved outward through an entire community in a way that's difficult to fully capture unless you were there to see it happen in real time. By the weekend following the sheriff's press conference, the memorial had grown large enough that county workers reportedly began coordinating with the family's extended relatives about how it might eventually be relocated to a permanent site. Something more lasting than a mailbox and a fence line. Somewhere Javeayah's memory could be visited for years, not just weeks after this case eventually leaves the headlines. Legally, this case is still moving through its earliest stages, even after everything that's already come to light. Both parents are currently only accused, not convicted, of every charge against them, including the newest ones. No evidence has yet been tested in front of a jury, and that distinction still matters, no matter how overwhelming the public account of this case has become. What comes next, according to the sheriff's office, is a continued push toward formal charges being finalized, additional court dates being set, and prosecutors building the case that will eventually be presented at trial. Sawyer has said his office remains committed to seeing this through completely, regardless of how emotionally difficult that process continues to be for everyone involved, investigators, the coroner's office, and the community that has spent weeks living through every update alongside them. There are still unanswered questions. Investigators have not detailed publicly every piece of evidence that led them specifically to the Debutary Creek search site, only that it developed as an area of interest during the course of their investigation. They have not said whether additional charges beyond the ones already filed remain possible, though past statements suggest that possibility hasn't been ruled out. And perhaps most painfully, investigators have been direct that it's unlikely all of Javeayah's remains will ever be recovered, meaning some part of this story may never reach the kind of full closure her family and community are hoping for. Notice this. Even facing that reality, the sheriff's office chose to hold a press conference rather than release these details quietly through a written statement. That choice to stand in front of cameras and deliver this news directly, in person, visibly affected, says something about how seriously this office has taken its responsibility to this community throughout the entire case. What do you think the final charges in this case will ultimately look like once prosecutors finish building their case? Tell us your prediction in the comments below. Javeayah Harris was 4 years old. She liked Minnie Mouse. She liked chasing chickens through her yard in the South Carolina heat. Pink was her favorite color, and this week, an entire sheriff's department wore it for her because it was the smallest way they had left to say her name with tenderness after everything their investigation had forced them to uncover. She should have started kindergarten in a year or two. She should have had an entire childhood ahead of her, scraped knees, first days of school, birthday parties, a whole unwritten life stretching out the way every 4-year-old's life is supposed to. Instead, her name is now known because of a search that stretched across thousands of acres and later across a reservoir 2 hours from home. Because of a sheriff who stood in front of cameras twice, once with hope and once with something far heavier, and told the truth both times, even when the truth was almost unbearable to say out loud. An entire community prayed for her safe return before anyone knew what had really happened. Strangers who never met her cried at a mailbox, turned memorial. 100 people showed up on a single evening just to stand together in her memory. That is what she deserved from the very beginning of her short life. To be protected, to be safe, to be surrounded by people willing to fight for her. It is devastating beyond words that so much of that came only after it was already too late. Javeayah's story is not finished. The legal case against her parents is only just beginning. Additional charges may still follow. And while nothing can undo what happened to her, the very least this community and this platform can offer her now is this: her name spoken clearly, her story told honestly, and a promise that pink ribbons will keep showing up long after this case leaves the headlines. Rest easy, Javeayah. This is MotiveX, and we will keep following your story until there is justice. Somewhere right now, that memorial outside the family home is still growing. Somewhere right now, a sheriff's department that spent weeks searching for a living little girl is instead preparing case files, evidence logs, and charging documents for a trial that could take months, even years, to fully resolve. And somewhere right now, 2 people who once described the not knowing as the thing that was killing them are sitting in a jail cell, denied bond twice over, facing charges that carry the weight of everything investigators say they now believe happened inside that home. None of that undoes what happened to Javeayah. Nothing can. But it does mean that this case, unlike so many others that fade from headlines within a news cycle, is going to be followed through to the end. By law enforcement, by this community, and by this channel. If this case affected you the way it's clearly affected an entire community, let us know in the comments and tell us honestly, do you think this case will end in a trial or a plea?